Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Leitner with the Smithsonian. I'm here with Ashley and Jim. We're going to go through another easy peasy with the Smithsonian routine today. During this webinar series, we're modeling routine from Harvard's Project Zero. These are often done in person, but they are great ways to think about engaging your students online as we're all testing out sort of virtual learning experiences. So Jim's going to lead the routine with Ashley, and I'll step back and I'll facilitate with comments. We'll model through the routine and then take more general questions about thinking about ways to use this in your classroom, both in person and online at the end. So in the spirit of modeling, we're going to start with a social and emotional learning opener. So in the chat, I'd like you to name an icon or a symbol that represents your home or where you're from. So I'll give you a chance to think about that. I'll post the question in the chat as well, and then take a look at what some other people are thinking about. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim and Ashley now, and let's get started.
Great. Thank you, Allison. And hi, Ashley.
Hi, good to see you.
Hi, everybody. So today we're going to be engaging with a Project Zero thinking routine that's called Looking 10 times 2. And like other thinking routines, it has only a few easy steps to use. And it encourages us to slow down and really observe carefully. But it also helps us to move away from first impressions, and it helps us to, again, move beyond obvious details as we go through it. It can work with all kinds of content. It works especially well with visual art, but I've seen it used equally well with text, with scientific phenomena, with infographics, among other things. So before we use it together, I'm going to ask you to grab a writing utensil and some paper, as the routine requires you to make lists. So Ashley just held up her notebook and her pen, and I've got a piece of paper here too. And you might want to draw a line down the middle of the page. I can't get that right. There you go. A line down the middle of the page, because we're going to be doing listing 2 different times as we go through this routine. So at this point, I'm going to ask Ashley if she'd bring up the object that we're going to examine. And I'm not going to say anything about it in terms of background. We're just going to take a look at it, a careful look at it. And after we finish looking at it and using the routine, then I'll fill in some background about it, because I know you'll be curious about it. So our first step is to do some close looking for about 30 seconds. So you see the object there. And Ashley's going to guide us across the image so that we can see various details. So just take 30 seconds to look carefully. Let your eyes wander as you take it in. The top, going down. You might think about color, shapes, line, texture. All right, thank you, Ashley. Now, on the left-hand side of the paper, if you'll list 10 things that you've noticed. These should be words or phrases. It can be anything, whatever comes to mind about any aspect of the picture. So list 10 things just quickly down on your paper. All right, as you're continuing to list, or you might already have your list, I'm going to invite you to use the comment section to list maybe 1 or 2 things from your list. And as you're doing that, Ashley and I are going to engage orally here on just sharing some of the ideas that she's come up with on her list. So Ashley, why don't you share 1 or 2 items from your list that you noticed?
Sure. So one of the things I noticed was kind of the posture and positioning. And so the hand in the air and the chin up.
Okay, so Ashley noted the hand raised in the air, and that we see that's the right hand, and we see the chin up. Ashley, what drew your attention? Let's go focus on the chin. What drew your attention to the chin?
As we were looking closely and kind of honing in on specific details, just thinking about kind of if I were in that position, to have, that posture there, and noticing kind of the chin just elevated, as well as kind of that stance with the hand up in the air. So those were kind of some of the visual clues and details that I noticed specifically about this object.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so let's see if you have some things that you've noticed. Type them in the comment section. We're just going to take a look at some of your details as well, the things that you've noticed about this object.
Stephanie notices a green robe and a crown.
Great, so we see a crown on the head of the figure, and we see a green robe. Thank you, Stephanie.
Hannah's noticing a bouquet of tomatoes.
Interesting way of describing that, a bouquet of tomatoes. I notice a bucket that's holding those tomatoes, a red bucket that's holding those tomatoes.
I have to admit, I thought they were apples at first until we saw the bucket. When I was looking further out, I thought it was, or I assumed it was an apple, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Right, and that's where when we're zooming in and looking really carefully, we can start to notice those specific details. So we see these round objects in there, but what exactly they are, when we get in there, we see closer that looks more like, the shape looks more like a tomato than an apple. We can clarify our thinking.
I noticed the expression on her face. She has these really like pursed lips. Looks like she's thinking in an unhappy way to me.
Interesting. Okay, so expression, you're noticing expression, and by the pursed lips, perhaps some deep thinking that is going on there, or thinking about something, maybe a topic very serious.
Mm-hmm. Veronica says the same thing. She says she knows her mouth is closed. She's visibly not smiling. Mm-hmm. Abby notices there are no feet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we might go down and right. Notice that the robe that Steph noticed earlier goes down to probably what would be around her knees, and so we don't see the bottoms of her legs, the feet, there. So it stops at that point. Okay.
Abby also said she looks determined. Philip was noticing that she's looking straight ahead.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if we can maybe zoom in on the eyes again, we'll take a look at those eyes. We've noticed the pursed lips, we've noticed the expression, and now we can see the eyes looking straight ahead, and we can see that with the way the eyes are positioned and the semblance of eyeballs in there.
Michelle says her skin is dark, as is her hair.
Mm-hmm.
Stephanie notices that the clothing is draped.
Okay, so we notice the skin color, that it's brown, it's darker. We notice dark hair, and we notice that this green robe is draped on her. It looks draped on her. Interesting word choice there.
Jerm is saying back in the old days, if an audience didn't like what they saw, they used tomatoes to express their dissatisfaction.
Good. So that connotation of the tomatoes there, so throwing tomatoes at something on stage or something you don't like, so that idea of maybe trying to bring some meaning to what these tomatoes represent, why the use of tomatoes in this.
Mm-hmm. Dominique's noticing she has a look of dissatisfaction. Deborah's noticing a tomato in the hand to worship or to launch.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good. And I'm going to I'm just going to follow up with Dominique if you're willing to write a comment in response to my question. I'm wondering where you see the dissatisfaction. What makes you think of dissatisfaction in the figure's face? We'll wait a second for Dominique's response. One thing I noticed too is this, we noticed the green robe and that it's draped, but also I noticed that there are a lot of folds in it. So we see those folds when we look closely. A lot of lines created. All the way down. Yep. Okay, we'll come back. If Dominique gives us a response, we'll come back to her response. But we're going to do this exercise again. So as I said, the idea of the thinking routine is to move us beyond first impressions and the obvious So what we're going to do is take another close look for a few seconds, and then we're going to create a second list. So for example, here's my first list that I have, and now I'm going to use the right-hand side of the paper, and I'm going to create a second list, having looked closely, but also having benefited from hearing or seeing some of the responses that my peers have. So let's look closely, and then we're going to jot down 10 more things, words or phrases, 10 more things that we notice by looking closely.
And then, so just to point out, right now we're using the Smithsonian's Learning Lab to zoom in to be able to see some of this detail too. So as you can see, we've been kind of honing in on some of these visual clues to be able to get a better understanding of the object itself.
All right. So if you have your list, your second list of 10 things you've noticed, if you could start with jotting one or two of those in the comment section. And I'm going to again ask Ashley to draw from her list to share maybe something that she's noticing on a more careful look the second time.
Yeah, so I think what you said, Jim, too, about hearing other people's thoughts kind of started to spur my own thoughts about this in kind of a deeper way. So one thing I thought about was perhaps kind of a representation or inclusion when I look at this object, kind of more of a concept than a specific visual detail. And I was thinking that based on some of the comments about the Statue of Liberty, but this new representation of the Statue of Liberty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what features specifically indicate it's a different interpretation or a different rendering of the Statue of Liberty? What are some things that stand out to you, Ashley?
Sure. So I think when Michelle mentioned the darker skin tone, that was pointed out. Also, what's being held too, right? So I think many of us are familiar with the Statue of Liberty on Ellis Island. And here there's a different kind of take on the Statue of Liberty, which I thought was kind of interesting too.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, for me too, the tomatoes offer something really a clear difference in what we saw in the original Statue of Liberty. To think about the pose being the same, but yet what the Lady Liberty is holding being very, very different there. So it makes me wonder about that. So we've got some really good comments here. Allison, I wonder if you want to try to...
Yeah, so we have a number of comments about the crown. So Durham's noticing there are 7 points on her crown. Hannah's noticing it's imperfect. And Georgina's wondering if there's a significance behind the points not being straight.
Right, right. So if we take a closer look at that crown, we see all those things that have been mentioned. And so it gives us a chance to focus on one particular aspect of this object and wondering if there's some meaning behind that.
Mm-hmm. Georgina's also wondering, it sort of connects, that the drapery is so heavy and it seems like it's weighing her down, and the crown looks heavy too.
Mm-hmm. So this kind of heaviness, and we already mentioned the facial expression, the look of dissatisfaction, the look of seriousness, the pursed lips, the lack of smiling. So maybe wondering if this heavy drapery and the heavy crown are contributing to that, or are meant to be part of that overall impression that we're supposed to have.
Mm-hmm. And then Philip has some comments. He notices that the bucket is full and the tomatoes look full and beautiful, but are still fragile.
Mm-hmm. So thinking about the nature of fruit and tomatoes, that they're fresh, they're freshly picked, but that we know they won't last long. So they're here, everything looks very luscious the way they're depicted, but also knowing there's an ephemeral quality to them. They won't last all that long.
Miss D. Bell follows up. She wonders, a question that comes up is, do the tomatoes represent liberty in some way?
Mm-hmm. thinking of the original meaning behind the Statue of Liberty as a symbol of freedom, of liberty for us, do the questions somehow represent liberty? Getting really behind meaning.
Yeah, and she followed up, it makes her think of the migrant workers in California seeking a better life, and the irony is clear. And then Veronica said, building on Abby's comment, I see her eyes are a bit squinted and tilted, but she's not frowning. This suggests to me a seriousness and experience, wisdom, firm, but not surprised.
Good. So really a lot of reading into these facial expressions, seeing all kinds of ways that we could go with that. But again, a lot of nuance in what Veronica's writing, that the eyes are squinted and a little bit tilted, but she's not frowning. There are pursed lips there, but there's not a frown that's suggested yet. So perhaps we're seeing seriousness and wisdom, this experience that comes from wisdom, that kind of thing. So again, really, really nice details there listed about the expression, about what we get from the face.
And Deborah's following up on Miss D. Bell's comments about the tomatoes, saying, are the tomatoes symbolizing freedom for some, but oppression for others, like a sarcastic take on freedom?
There's a lot into that as well. I noticed a note above from Stephanie that the drapery reminds her of a choir robe or Greek tunic. And she had mentioned earlier about it being draped, so now she's making these connections with it. So we're going to stop at this point, and I'm going to share some of the background to this piece, but then we're going to come back to the looking 10 times 2 and talk about what it brought us, and have you share some ideas too about what you noticed as we move from the first list to the second list. But first, let me just share some background to you with you about this piece. And so it's a rendering of the Statue of Liberty. We noted that right away. And it's in the collection of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. It's part of an exhibition that debuted in 2017 that's called Many Voices, One Nation. It's not currently on display in the museum, however. It's made out of papier-mache, and it's a sculpture that was created in the year 2000 by an artist named Kat Rodriguez, and she and a team of farm workers from Immokalee, Florida. It's a region in it's a part of a region in Southwest Florida that is very fertile. They created this, and they specifically created it for a 2-week, 230-mile march they were doing. It was called the March for Dignity, Dialogue, and Fair Wages, and it was a protest that was organized by the the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which in the last 20 years has become quite a well-renowned civil rights and human rights organization. The protesters along the way in this 230-mile march, they represented community activists, farm workers, and environmentalists. It was a very multiracial, very, very diverse crowd of people who made the march. This area of Florida, it's in Southwest Florida. It's on the edge of the Everglades, and that area was at one point in history drained. The swamps around it were drained, and it became very, very fertile ground, and it's especially known as a tomato growing region. So there's been a history of the tomato workers there, many of them immigrants who have been exploited, not paid fair wages. And so this movement in the early 2000s was to try to bring fair wages to those workers. So I'm going to ask Ashley if she would show us a photograph of some of the workers carrying this statue. This is, again, all in the collection that we'll, again, share with you. But you can see how large it is. It's almost twice the size of some of the humans who are represented there. But they're carrying it up on a pedestal. And there was actually a pedestal made for it. And on that pedestal, we don't have a picture of it here, but there is one in the collection. There's a pedestal, a black pedestal on which it rests. And on that pedestal is the inscription, "I too am America." And that line is the last line of a poem by Langston Hughes that's called "I Too." Many of you might know that poem, "I Too." So that the pedestal has that inscription, "I too am America," from the poem. So we notice a lot of details there, and now we've got a little bit of background to the piece. And I'd like to see if you have any questions about the piece, any more questions, things that I might not have covered, or things that you're really interested in knowing. And if we can't answer the question, then we can send you to some resources where you can find some answers. So if you have any questions or you want to make a comment, certainly feel free to use that comment section to type it in.
Yeah, I think it was interesting, Jim, to be able to see it in context too. One of the comments that we didn't make about the original statue is, how it was in context. So thinking about the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island, it's this stone sculpture. It's kind of meant to stay in one place, whereas this one seems like it's meant to kind of be moved around. It's much more handmade. It's the material is lighter so that it could be carried up on your shoulder. So things to think about as we're making comparisons, especially in our earlier conversation to the Statue of Liberty too.
Right. There's also an interesting idea of that ephemerality, I think, that comes in what you just mentioned, but also in some of the comments about tomatoes. We know that they won't last for very long. These are tomatoes made out of papier-mache, but interestingly, the leaves on them are made out of felt, so it has that very lush, natural quality to it. So this sculpture was made out of papier-mache, but it also has real fabric that's on it, and certainly the steel wire to create the forms. But it had to be sturdy enough to be able to last on this 230-mile, 2-week march, withstanding the outdoors. They were carrying it outdoors in heat and most likely in rain and harsh conditions. But as we know, with these materials, they're not going to last forever. So it's now preserved in the museum, but we also know that it will have not as long a life as for example, the original Statue of Liberty. So I want to take us back to looking 10 times 2 and the time that we have, and just talk a little bit about the routine, and certainly contribute ideas in the comment section if you have them about your own experience with it. One thing I'll note is that from the first list and the first sharing of the list that we did to the second sharing, there was a clear shift in the kind of sophisticated responses that we were having. We first were looking at some of the basic details, looking at colors, looking at the different things that we were seeing for the first time. But as we got into that second list, and especially benefiting from hearing from what people were noticing, we were going deeper and deeper into interpretation, thinking about facial expression, thinking about the reasoning behind the use of the heavy fabric or the heavy crown, noticing the way that the crown was shaped and the spikes of that crown. So we're getting into all kinds of more detailed ideas. And the ways that this routine can be used, it can be used in all kinds of ways, but ways that teachers have noted that it can be really helpful with students is that, one, it's a great pre-writing exercise. So that if you have writing that you're doing either in the language arts classroom or in any kind of subject area classroom, the pre-writing exercise of looking 10 times 2 can help students come up with ideas, brainstorm ideas about things they might want to write about. But it also might give them a lot of language that they can use, certainly the concrete nouns, the modifiers, the kinds of language, rich language that they can use as they begin a writing exercise or some kind of narrative. Also, I think you can adapt this. What I love about thinking routines is that they can be adapted, and they're not meant to be prescriptive, but how this could be adapted. Let's say I have some young learners, and it would be really challenging for them to come up with 10 things on their list. Well, I might say, let's do 5 times 2. Let's come up with 5 things. So I can adapt it either in the middle of it, or I can adapt it before I begin. You know your learners, and you know your learning goals. So thinking about how you adapt a routine to the situation is really, really important, and then making it work. Also, it could be listening 10 times 2. So let's say you have a piece of music or you have some audio you'd like to play. It could be all about working on audio listening skills. It could be viewing times 10. So you could look at a short TED Talk, or you could look at some other piece of film or video, and then think about what you viewed, what you watched. So it could be adapted in that way as well. And I'm going to invite you, again, in the time that we have, if you have some ideas about ways you could see it adapted to your own context, again, feel free to write in the comments section some ideas you might have, or maybe you've used this before and you want to share how you've used it. I also want to say something about the piece that we've used today. It could be useful in a lesson when we talk about how we're inspired by other works of art or other objects. And there's certainly in art history, there's a tradition of appropriation whereby artists take an element or take an image and then recontextualize it. And while the original meaning stays with that work that they appropriated, the new work might take on larger meanings. And we certainly see that here with Kat Rodriguez's piece, how she made it fit the cause that she was so passionate about, which was fair wages for these workers in Southwest Florida. And the Statue of Liberty, of course, is a very powerful symbol for us in the United States, and it can mean different things to different people. And Kat Rodriguez endows it with the things that were special to her context, those tomatoes, the dark skin like many of the workers, the dark hair. Let's see what some of the things you are writing about in your comment section might lead us to understand.
So Stephanie's noting that it's interesting to use words in different languages to make connections.
Mm-hmm.
One thing too that came up for me, Jim, when you were talking was the idea of using listening 10 times 2. It would be interesting to pair, spoken word, for example, poetry from Langston Hughes, and maybe pair the image with the poem as kind of a way to think about this in both the visual as well as kind of hearing those words echoed alongside it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we have a text of the poem in the collection in the Learning Lab. You can find that collection under Statue of Liberty. Statue of Liberty and Symbolism. Ashley created the collection, but it's got the text of the poem. It's got some background information. It's got that image we saw of the workers holding up the Statue of Liberty by Kat Rodriguez as well. You see
it looks like Allison also included the link to the collection in the chat. It's also in the description of this video too. So if you're watching this either live or archived or sending this to a friend, all of these resources that we've been discussing today are also archived for you. This session will also be archived too, I wanted to mention. So in addition to the ability to participate in these sessions live and kind of interact with colleagues and have the benefit of the chat box together, you can also kind of rewatch these over to think about how you might make some slight tweaks to your own teaching and learning context too. So there's the ability to kind of watch these archives and fast forward and rewind as you'd like to.
Paula has an interesting comment in the chat that I'd like to try reflecting 10 by 2 on emotions felt during a real life situation or environment or while experiencing a specific scene in a film or a play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that idea. And I think I really admire the way that Paula has thought about adapting it. But the idea of kind of cooling down, maybe in a heightened emotional situation, this gives us a way to kind of cool down and to start reflecting and to think about things that we're feeling or things that we're noticing. So it can be used in all kinds of ways. But the key piece of it is to try to get away from that fast-paced life that we might be living in normal times, and to really look carefully, look for details, and then think about where those details might lead us as in our thinking. So as long as you keep this thinking, the thinking at the center of what you're doing, and attaching it to the kind of learning goal that you have, it can work with all kinds of wonderful objects, artworks, things that you might have that you teach with on a regular basis. So I commend this routine to you, and that's all I have for today. But I hope you might join us on Wednesday when we're going to do this again with a different object.
I had a follow-up question for you too, Jim. So as we're thinking about this routine, are there things that we should keep in mind as we're looking for objects or images to pair with the routine? I noticed this specific object is somewhat seemingly simple on the kind of outset. When you first look at it, there's not a whole lot to it, but obviously even in our 30-minute conversation, I felt like we covered a lot of ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what it does, like See, Think, Wonder, which we used a couple of weeks ago, it really is about that close observation. So if you feel that you have a need to have students really take a close look at something before they dive in, it really helps do the thinking before the doing, which many of us really want to practice with our students. So thinking about something you're looking at or listening to or paying attention to, where you're going to want people to slow down, your students to slow down and really consider before they jump in. It can be a math problem. It can be scientific phenomena, those kinds of things. All I would say is that it probably needs to have multi-layers or many things to be able to observe, because if you're going to ask them to make a list of 10 things and then 10 more things, you want there to be enough in it to be able to create those lists.
That's great.
And Ashley, Hannah in the chat is wondering how we learn about other easy peasies. So you want to direct to some resources?
Absolutely, absolutely. So Hannah, and to everyone who's watching and watching the archive as well, if you visit the learninglab.si.edu/distance learning, we have an embedded calendar of opportunities, including Easy Peasy, that are basically live opportunities to connect with Smithsonian experts, to connect with different ideas for how to approach distance learning. So you can check out the calendar there. We have been doing these sessions Mondays and Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern. And this is just about our 5th session, if I'm right. I think so. And so you can actually watch all of the archives as well. So if you go to the Smithsonian Learning Lab, which is learninglab.si.edu, and type in Easy Peasy, you'll see the 5 archived episodes, as well as additional resources that go along with it. I should point out what we're looking at on the screen is part of the Learning Lab collection for this session. So what we've done here is each session has additional resources for how to implement this within the classroom. Each session includes the prompt, the thinking routine that we're focusing on. So for example, this week we're looking at looking 10 times 2. It gives additional information in the resource information button here on the side, so you know how to launch it, suggestions for what type of thinking this encourages. And then as we go through, you can also see the object itself. I used the Zoom tools a lot during our conversation, which I think actually added additional opportunities for viewers, but also your own learners to be able to look closely at this object. We also could have used some of the additional views of the object to kind of change our perspective as we're looking at the object too. So some resources in the Smithsonian do have multiple images. There's additional context and background about Project Zero thinking routines, the specific routine itself, as well as the object. And so here there's a video with a National Museum of American History curator who's going through kind of some of the context for this object, as well as a blog post from the National Museum of American History and I Too by Langston Hughes. So there's some connections that could be made and some extensions. And then finally, there's the webinar archive. So immediately after this broadcast ends, it'll be available for you at the same link or here in the collection. And there's also opportunities to dig deeper into Project Zero's online offerings as well. So for each session, each 30-minute session, we have a collection that goes along with it of resources to help you to start to think about how you might use it in your own context.
Great. Thank you. I think we're about out of time. So thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to see you again on Wednesday at 1 o'clock. And as you leave today, we'd like you to think about the role of icons and symbols in our culture, and why they hold so much meaning for us, and how their meaning might change over time. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you Wednesday.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.